Hello everyone, my name is Manuel Marcano and I make video games. Today, I want to talk a little bit about the type of game I specialize in, which is RPGs. Now instead of getting into a messy discussion about RPG mechanics just yet, I think we should go over something that is often perceived as a dirty word. I'm talking about linear. Being linear doesn't always have to be a bad thing. A lot of the games we absolutely love are linear and offer very little deviation from the path set by the narrative. Final Fantasy VI is extremely linear in its narrative until we hit the later half of the game. Final Fantasy XIII is linear as well, but painfully so. It ends up being a problem and not a tool. Linearity can be very effective for the narrative, as it makes the player focus on the story being told, specifically the details. When those details aren't being explored, then it all just becomes restrictive. So let's take a look at some examples. In Final Fantasy VI, we come across the raunchy playboy prince of Figaro, Edgar, who hints at having a younger brother. There's a few story sequences as well as environmental hints, like the fact that there are two thrones, or that most of the castle is mirrored to emphasize two halves, but the possibility of this unseen brother is not really focused on. As the party makes its way through the plot, the player, who is given the chance to speak with villagers in the town of Figaro as well as the castle of Figaro, can also visit a small house where Edgar mentions that he loved a certain type of flower or a certain type of tea present in the house. On the nearby mountain path, which serves as a dungeon, they see a shadowy figure hopping around as they progress. Near the end, the party is faced with an impossible boss fight, and the king's twin brother Sabin shows up to save them. At this point in the story, we know where he's from, who his parents are, who his living family is, who he associates with, what his motivations are, and even the fact that he likes tea and flowers. Now keep in mind this is early on, and he continues to be developed through his interactions throughout the game. So allowing the player the ability to find this information with very little actually forced makes the narrative more solid and provides a better sense of meaning and cohesion. That is what we call world building. Final Fantasy XIII doesn't have any of that. It's hard to really say anything about any of the characters, their motivations, or bits about where they come from, or even the world they live in, because the entire game, even the one area that's not a straight line, is jumping from battle to battle with little or no dialogue, and especially no NPCs. Instead, you get to scour the world for random drops, side quests, and chests that unlock entries in a journal. This hurts the overall narrative in a number of ways, because it first and foremost takes away an important piece of storytelling in removing the context of the information. Finding a guard's journal that describes his transformation into a zombie, and then killing a lurking zombie in the room in Resident Evil, is world building, and a very good example of how to build a narrative. Finding a cryptic report written by an unseen character after beating a boss is not. It could be worse though. You could be forced to log into a website to get paragraphs about why your armor exists. People often say that both Final Fantasy XIII and Final Fantasy VI open up as the players progress. So let's take a look at what I like to call the linear bubble, a situation where the player is able to explore but is still faced with the endgame that will serve as the climax of the story. The second half of Final Fantasy VI starts off with two huge choices. The first being, do we let Shadow die? This in itself is more choice than Final Fantasy XIII ever gives. Shadow has an entire quest line in which it is hinted he is Relm's father, and it actually reveals his real name, and how he came to be the ruthless mercenary the party recruits. It even ties up the mystery of why Interceptor, Shadow's dog, takes a liking to Relm. From there, the player is given a number of choices, like who to go out and save from the original party, whether or not Cid will live by catching fish, and how many of the characters find peace with the events that occurred throughout the game. For example, taking Cyan to Doma to clear his conscience. In stark contrast, Final Fantasy XIII offers you one open area and a bunch of straight lines surrounding it. There aren't any long quests that tell you something about the character, or any kind of choice about who lives or dies. You only have the opportunity to kill monsters, and they don't have much of a story behind them. They're monsters. Kill them, they will see, and they ran out of time. So kill them. The difference really manifests itself between the two games at the very end. Final Fantasy VI has an end state that varies, if only slightly, depending on how many characters you saved, who you decided to save, and it even has a little bit of falling action in explaining how the world will rebuild after the catastrophe that was Kefka. We have an idea of what each of the surviving characters is going to do, and what the effects of killing the god of magic are on the world. Final Fantasy XIII, on the other hand, well, some stuff happens. Not a lot of it is talked about in-game. The characters turn into fal'Cie and run out of time. Then they turn back, mysteriously, and then they merge their summon forms. And this all just happened because they did exactly what the bad guys wanted them to do, and then it just ends. We don't get any kind of falling action at all, just two spin-off sequels, and we never get an explanation as to why the party turned back to their original forms or how they were able to merge summons. They just never get talked about. Now, I'm not trying to beat up on Final Fantasy XIII, but, well, it's a really good example of how not to construct a story or world. There's a lot of holes left, like the ones I pointed out, and there's a lot just never makes sense. We see how Final Fantasy VI is remembered fondly and regarded as one of the best video game stories ever told. Even after 20 years, people regularly feature it in events like Awesome Games Done Quick, and Kotaku even had an article about replaying favorites where it was featured. Well, Final Fantasy XIII was met with lukewarm reception, and is very rarely talked about fondly within the media. And few people are openly showing their love and replaying what is a fairly recent game. What this all comes down to is trying to build better worlds, so that we can more effectively deliver a narrative, and with that, a message. Very few games, especially RPGs, which are known for having a strong narrative, do that effectively these days. So I'd like to ask the question, why? In the coming months, I'll be talking about how to create better worlds by continuing on to characterization and diversity. So stay tuned, and thanks for listening to my little rant.